Chapter 13, crime. Yeah, now we're getting to the fun stuff. We need to talk about crime and what goes on in the United States in terms of business crimes, etc., etc. So, start here, and I just put this on a while back. I don't know that this really fits with the criminal, but I think it was very interesting. If you guys remember, the Westboro Baptist Church is the old boy who led this congregation to picket military funerals because he thought that the fact that our soldiers were dying was proof that God hated us for allowing homosexual marriages. Yeah, it was an interesting concept that this particular congregation had, but they'd show up and they would protest, and in fact did so at which senator? Was it a prior senator? Might have been one of our prior senators, whose like nephew, I think, happened to have been killed in action, and I think they came and protested even here in Montana. And this particular dad, Snyder, I believe, went and sued them and said, you guys don't have any right to do that, and went all the way to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Westboro Baptist Church, and basically said no matter how distasteful we find it, again, here's the quote: our profound national commitment to free and open debate. Oh no, this was kind of in the dissent. Okay, Sam Alito was the lone dissenter. He said our profound national commitment to the free and open debate is not a license for the vicious verbal assault that occurred in this case. But he was the lone dissenter. So 8 others agreed that no, this was the free exercise. Their protests were peaceful. They weren't trying to incite violence or anything like that. So, an interesting case. So criminal law, right, provides a means to punish wrongdoers who affect ownership of property. Keep in mind, property has got a broader definition than just real property. We're talking about personal property and all those things, right? And any crime it's a wrong against society, and business crimes are no different. And there are both federal and state penal codes. I suppose probably local as well. I don't know so much here in Montana if we have any separate legal penal codes in the local. I'm sure they do in New York and places like that, but originally business law really didn't consist of the understanding of criminal law. We didn't throw it in. I mean, there were still crimes being committed, don't get me wrong, but we just didn't toss it in there because it just didn't seem like that big of a deal, I guess. But it's changed, right? And why has it changed? Well, we're getting some things like this going on, and the old Bernie Madoff one's getting a little bit old. I'm having trouble coming up with really good new examples of some business law things or business types of crimes, white collar crimes, I guess we would say, that have occurred here recently that everybody would kind of know about. But Bernie Madoff was a good one. He scammed people out of millions and millions of dollars. Really an effective scheme, and it's amazing he was able to do it. We go back to Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart's back on her feet and doing okay. You guys probably find some stuff about Martha Stewart. She probably even shows up in the public a little bit, but Martha Stewart was accused of insider trading. Ultimately, she was convicted of obstruction of justice. Okay, and what happened there, and we'll talk about that just briefly, but she was given a tip to sell a stock that had not, it was in a drug company, and a drug that they had was not going to get approval from the FDA, and she found out a day ahead of time by the owner, who was a friend of hers. The owner, the CEO of the company, tipped her off, and so she sold her stock. She benefited to the tune of about $200,000, which for her was nothing. But that didn't make it any less wrong, and so she was indicted and brought to trial, but she was required to produce some documents, which she did not. And we'll talk about that in regards to the Fifth Amendment. And so thus was accused of and was found guilty of obstruction of justice. So they didn't have the evidence then, because she wouldn't provide it. They didn't have the evidence that might have gotten her for insider trading, but they were able to then get her for obstruction of justice. And she spent 6 months in the Hooskow, and Hooskow's prison, for those of you too young to know. And then she also spent, I think, an additional 6 months under house arrest. But she's back to being wealthy and in the public domain. Enron was a huge one, just huge scandal that occurred. Enron is why we have Sarbanes-Oxley, which we talk a little bit. I think we spent a whole chapter about that a little later on. Arthur Anderson was their auditor, and things just didn't go well, and I won't relive a bunch of those. It's an interesting story. If you want to hear about it, just ask me, right? So it's wrong against society, prohibited by statute. I put a nice little funny on here. Unfortunately, again, this one does not fit our time frame anymore, because George Carlin's dead, for one, and he was the one that had said this. And it says, boy, I feel a lot safer now that she's behind bars. So you got to go back to when she was in prison. O.J. Simpson's still walking around. Of course, he's not now. And Osama bin Laden, too. Of course, he's long since dead now. But they take the one woman in America willing to cook, clean, and work in the yard and haul her ass off to jail. Well, Martha Stewart's famous for Martha Stewart Living and cooking. You know, she had cooking shows before cooking shows were popular, and how to, run your house efficiently and effectively and be a good wife and all those other things. And so that's kind of what Carlin's comments were about there. George Carlin, unfortunately, is dead, and he was a great comedian. So inherently wrong, right? We have crimes, and I don't worry about the Latin here. I'm pretty sure I don't test you on that. And, killing, obviously, stealing, those types of things, but we've got some other things that have been deemed wrong, right? Business entities, desk workers, accountants, attorneys, officers, but even others. These types of business crimes can occur by the people working in the loading dock, and there was an example of that a while back, but so anybody within an organization, right, can be a part of those business crimes. Number of arrests, a little bit dated, but you see, embezzlement, the actual theft of money, has stayed pretty even. Forgery and counterfeiting, that's interesting, isn't it? And then fraud, I've actually seen a bit of a decrease, there probably was an increase here in 2007, partly because of the recession that we went through and whatnot. 2007, 2008, it wouldn't surprise me that would have seen fraud claims go way up during that period of time. So they can be a felony, right? There's an indictment in a grand jury. There doesn't always have to be a grand jury for felony indictments. Felony indictments can come from a county attorney and, in our area and whatnot. It could lead to fine or imprisonment, but we do often look at grand juries when we talk about big felonies. Certainly for federal crimes it would be. Misdemeanors, right? Information, it's a government charge. Again, you probably get your county attorney or local district attorney, right, making those types of charges depending on where you're at. Usually fine or jail of less than 1 year. So we have to have intent. Okay, for a crime to occur, there has to be intent. It has to be willful, knowing, and voluntary. And that is an important concept. It's an important concept throughout law, that somebody has to have intended to do something, right? Pleas, guilty or not guilty, the two basic ones that we know about, but one that you probably see as often as anything is this one, maybe more often than a lot of them, is the Latin nolo contendere or something like that, however it's pronounced, but it's a no contest plea. And I've read it in Montana and other states, I guess, as the Alford plea, which means that you admit that there's probably enough evidence to convict you, but you don't admit guilt. Okay, and often that plea comes into play. It's bargained for. It's a bargain for plea, Okay, and so it allows you to accept some punishment and whatnot, but then also if evidence comes to light later that might exonerate you, um, then you could certainly say, hey, I never did admit, right? Because if you plead guilty, that's basically an admission that you did the crime, right? This one's not an admission that you did the crime, but kind of go ahead and slap the back of my hands or whatever the punishment may be. It says criminal conviction may be basis for civil damages suit. So remember, we have those two systems, and while there's the principle of double jeopardy, that applies to criminal, law. It doesn't mean that there can't also be some civil damages that would come from it. So it can be both. No, my doesn't want to move. Grand jury. Grand juries are convened for major cases. If you think on the criminal regular side, murders and those types of things might typically have a grand jury. Certainly federal cases do. I've only known one person, an old buddy of mine, who was on a federal grand jury. He served there for a year. He had to make pretty regular trips to Great Falls in that case to convene the jury and go over evidence, right? So they determine if enough evidence exists to proceed with trial, but they don't determine guilt or innocence. Citizen jurists, I don't know why it's 23 on there. I don't think a grand jury is that big, but maybe it is. There's always that presumption of innocence. Interestingly, the grand jury has subpoena power. So they can say, hey, we want some additional information, and so it's not, when stuff goes before a grand jury, it's not like a regular jury, because they're not trying to determine the guilt or innocence. They're just trying to determine if evidence exists to go forward, if it's worthwhile going forward with the case. Are we likely to get a conviction? If not, why should we waste our time, going forward? And their proceedings are secret. Remember, other criminal things are very public. With the exception of some crimes related to sex and those types of things, and certainly youth crimes, our criminal system is very public. So constitutional protections, right? The Bill of Rights provides us that certain protections. I mean, that was essential for the passage of the Constitution, that we have some of these protections in there. And so it protects, people that are accused of crimes, people that have been convicted of crimes. There's protections for those, but it also protects businesses from excessive regulation. I'm starting to not believe that one as much as I once did. But Fourth Amendment, right, is a ban of unreasonable searches and seizures, and it does extend to certain civil matters. So even in civil matters, we can't have unreasonable searches and seizures. Maybe meaning that, if you're having a fight with your ex and you go into the house and you find some stuff, that comes up in a civil trial, you might not be able to use it because you obtained it illegally, right? So I think that's kind of what they're saying there. The expectation of privacy. And certainly this is taking on a whole new meaning with our digital age and whatnot. But I put on their bathrooms just as a reminder two quick stories. One was a young lady. There was a party going on as kids, and this was in Montana. And it's been several years ago, maybe a decade ago. But so the party ensued, and the cops got wind of it and busted the party. And so they went in, and they had, and a court later determined that they had reason to enter the party and start handing out tickets. But they got to the bathroom door and they knocked on that, and they said, we're going to come in, or we want you to come out. And the gal in there said, go to hell. And so I think an argument ensued, and finally I don't know if they broke the door down or they entered in some fashion anyhow. And so her parents, they went to court, and they said that was an illegal search, right? That you violated my expectation of privacy. And this, by the way, was not her house. She was at her friend's house. And the court ultimately agreed with her. And they said that was an unreasonable search, that they should have gone into the bathroom. She had said she was sick and la-da-da. So I found that interesting. And then I contrasted that with another case. It was about the same time, but a couple apparently had stopped in a gas station convenience store, and they'd gone into one of the bathrooms, and apparently were getting quite amorous. And so they got reported. Cops showed up, entered, and not only found them being amorous, but also discovered some drugs and whatnot. So they were arrested, and the couple sued and said that they had an expectation of privacy, and the court in this case said, nah. Nah, you're in a public restroom. Nah, and it's not going to happen. So, kind of a little bit of difference there, but we generally assume, meaning that there is an expectation of privacy, right? Not for some businesses, and what that means is some businesses are, for example, in banking. We were covered by the FDIC. We had some insurance through that. We were a Fed member, on and on. We were subject to audits. So when the auditor showed up, we had to let him in. We couldn't just lock the door and say, go to hell. We had to let him in and give him the right to come in and audit our books and look through those types of things. And the same would be the case for other businesses as well. Colleges, that accept federal money, those types of things, right? It's interesting. The word privacy is not contained in the U.S. Constitution, but they arose from common law decisions, right? So the Fifth Amendment protects us from self-incrimination, right? You have the right to remain silent. Okay? You do not have to testify against yourself, and you cannot be compelled to testify against yourself. But it does not protect against being required to produce evidence, right? So if there's evidence that may affect your case adversely, you still have to do that. And that's what Martha didn't do. Right, she didn't provide evidence, and so she was found guilty of obstruction of justice. Business records can be obtained. That definitely includes emails. Okay, emails. Your employer is required to keep records of your emails. Believe it or not. Now, why that doesn't extend to the former Secretary of State, I have no idea. But apparently, I don't know. We go back to the old rule of law and generally and equally applied, and sometimes I wonder a little bit. But anyhow, only it protects a sole proprietorship entity, because you can't separate a sole proprietorship really from the owner. Okay, a sole proprietorship is basically one and the same. Okay, and so there is certain protections that are granted a sole proprietorship that wouldn't be granted a partnership or a corporation or an LLC, etc. Again, double jeopardy is included in the Fifth Amendment, meaning that you cannot be tried to I was going to say conviction, but tried to conclusion for the same crime more than once. Okay, now that's a criminal proceeding. Okay, it's different from the civil proceeding. So you cannot be tried to conclusion. So if you're tried to conclusion, and conclusion would mean a verdict of guilty or innocent by a jury. Okay, and obviously if you're found innocent, there can be an appeal, and on and on and on. If you're found guilty, there can be an appeal. But when those things have concluded, then it's done. You can't be tried again for that same crime. The Sixth Amendment provides protections for, speedy public trial. By the way, and I've been curious about this, oftentimes I'll see a trial that seems to take forever. Why does it take so long? Doesn't the person have a right to a speedy trial? And when I've talked to our county attorney about it, the answer has always been that, well, generally the prosecutors are more than ready to go, but it's the defense that's waiting and trying to put off the trial for whatever reasons. Okay, trial by a jury. We're entitled to trial by a jury, and even in civil actions, and this may be in the test. I think the Constitution says for matters that exceed $20. It seems like that's probably a little bit out of hasn't kept up with inflation, but I think that's the way the law still reads it. In civil matters, if it exceeds $20, you do have a right to a trial by jury. Now, granted, that would get pretty expensive if you lost, right? Because you might have to pay the court costs. You have a right to be informed of the charge, and you have a right to confront the accuser. Again, the courts have made some provisions there for when we're talking about crimes of sexual nature, especially dealing with youth. Okay, you have a right to subpoena witnesses, and you have a right to an assistance of attorney. So part of the Miranda rights that we have, right? So some of the specific business crimes, and we'll go through, I think, each of these, but fraud, larceny. Fraud's, as we saw back earlier, is probably the more common. Larceny is just theft. That would be the embezzling. Conspiracy, these ones get to be smaller in terms of how often they take place. Generally, when corporations are charged with crime, corporate officers can also be criminally charged, say true. Employees of some businesses do not have Fourth Amendment protections because of public policy considerations. The business doesn't have, Fourth Amendment protection. Certainly, outside of the business context, the employees do. I mean, if you work at the bank and the bank's getting audited and you've got things, in your possession, you can't, and they belong to the business or they're a part of the business, you can't claim your Fourth Amendment rights there. You're compelled to turn that over, but you don't necessarily then have to turn over truly personal things that have no effect or no impact on the business itself. So that one's a little bit confusing, I think. So business, fraud, right? There has to be a scheme to defraud. Elements, you have to have intent. Again, the whole intent thing, misstatement of facts, material. It has to be material. There has to be justifiable reliance and injury, and then there's different types of ones that happen down there in terms of fraud. And there, the Bernie Madoff one was one. There's, and many of you, if I think I asked for that in the assignment, probably came up with the one here in Montana that was Epps, if I'm not mistaken, that they had a diamond mine thing going on or something, and they defrauded a bunch of people. And there's been some other fairly high-profile cases in Montana, in the last several decades that now are kind of ancient history, but that happens. Most of those that I speak of were securities frauds, selling an interest in a business that's supposed to take off and do extremely well, but then again, maybe not. Mail-in wire fraud, right? And I think we might have had some of that as an assignment too. Has to be interstate communications, which again, very broadly interpreted, email, all those things are interstate. Scheme to defraud, of course, legal aspects. So oftentimes the mail-in wire too just kind of adds that charge to it. It's just, if you're using the mail, you're using the internet. If you're doing the Nigeria bank thing, that's obviously a mail and wire fraud. The courts have, mail and wire was terms going back to, the postal service, but then wire might have been the old Morse code type of thing when it originally started, but now we've included internet and all other types of communication. Texting and all those things would fit under this as well. So a conspiracy, mainly we're just saying that there's more than one person, right? And carrying out a criminal offense, each member, agent, partner, member is willful, right? It has to commit an overt act, but you're not required to know the details, but you probably have to know. In other words, if you may be kind of an innocent victim, not know that Joe's taking advantage of you and embezzling money from the company. Okay, they might try to get you on conspiracy, but in that case, if you weren't actually committing an overt act, you might get off, right? Obstruction of justice, we've kind of talked about the obstruction of justice quite a bit, right? It can be cleaning up files. Again, wow. Changing record of phone conversation. I wonder, that probably applies to emails too, and shredding documents, or maybe like wiping them with a cloth. Oh, excuse me, I digress. I sometimes wonder how come, anyhow, false statement to a bank, right? Financial statements, banks are federally protected. So if you go in to get a loan and you present false information, you can certainly be subject to some penalties. And that happened one time in my career where a guy had done that. And we made them a loan. The loan went bad, and we were busy collecting on it. And and I remember the auditors came in, and we just taken our lumps. It wasn't a huge amount, but the auditor said, "Well, did you turn him over to the FBI?" And I said, "Well, no." And they said, "Well, you need to." And so we turned him over to the FBI, and they investigated. They even went to the poor fellow's hometown, and as is common here in this part of the state, it was a small hometown, and I had people calling me, "What the hell is the FBI doing here?" So they never prosecuted him, but it was kind of fun to know that I'm sure he was sweating bullets when the FBI came and talked to him about some of that stuff. So to a federal agency, same thing, right? Exculpatory, no. I had to go look that one up myself. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to test you on that, but that just says that if they ask you a question in a normal, conversation, basically, and you say, "No, I did not do that," that's kind of okay. It's not really considered a false statement, because it puts you in a bad choice. If you didn't say no, then you're basically admitting to it, and so it's kind of they're not going to prosecute you for saying no in a case like that. Larceny, right? Robbery, burglary, embezzlement, all those things. Use of company property without permission, right? That can be a part of it. So, we sometimes don't think about that. But padding expense accounts, there's been some cases like that, I think, just recently. Man, there's been even locally here, and there was one just very recently in our local credit union of embezzling, right? And that was just a pure embezzlement. There's a big one up in Malta. In the last, the crime actually occurred over several decades, but just came to light here in the last few years. There's been a few like that have happened, and here in Havre, there's been several other embezzlements, not just banks either, or credit unions. So, RICO, the Racketeering Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, I think, is what that stands for. And really, this, I'm not going to test you in depth on this thing. You kind of need to know what it is, and this kind of came out of the old mafia and what was happening. The head mafia guys would protect themselves, and how they would do that is basically there'd be a layer below them that paid rent to them, and it was the layer below them that went out and did all the dirty work. Okay, but they would pay rent then to the mafia heads, and the mafia heads then would obviously use that rent for whatever they wanted to, and kind of have some protection. And so they passed this, and it really said that, you know what, if your income's coming from those things and you have an idea that those are illicit activities, we can find you guilty of this RICO then. Cybercrime, new, right? Daily, you probably look it up daily, and there's stuff going on, and you guys probably know more about that than I do. We won't get into a lot of depth on that. But endangering workers too then can be a specific assault and battery, accidental homicide. You're required to do safety precautions, right? We do have rules and regulations that are in place for some of these things, and if you ignore those, you could be held very liable for those types of things, and could be criminal. Again, if the negligence is willful and wanton, it could rise to the level of being criminal. So the assault and battery would be straight out, like a CEO, physically threatening, that type of thing, maybe some other workers. So aiding and abetting is a federal charge. It's when somebody assists in a criminal act, they participate in a conspiracy. Okay, state charge is equal to an accessory to the crime, right? You're an accessory, and it can be before the crime or after the fact, either one. Picking up a hitchhiker is not illegal. Okay, if you picked up a hitchhiker knowing that person had committed a crime and you're giving them a ride to get away from prosecution, then you get in trouble, right? Then you are an accessory to that crime. Those are tough to prove, by the way. In Montana, when I read Montana Code Annotated, we talk about accountability, right? So a person's legally accountable for the conduct of another Okay, and so this is kind of similar, right? It says either before or during the commission of an offense with the purpose to promote or facilitate such commission, he solicits, aids, abets, aiding and abetting, right? Agrees to attempt to aid such person in planning or commission of the offense. Okay, so it's accountability in Montana is another term for aiding and abetting. I probably have that on the test. Bribery and kickbacks of a public official, certainly illegal, right? Okay. Illegal both domestically and internationally. There's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Fixing a college or professional sporting event. Wow, fixing, yeah. Go back to the Black Sox of 1918. Was it 1918 or 1916 or somewhere around there? The old Black Sox. That's probably one of the more famous ones. I wouldn't doubt that some of this came out of it, but basically the whole team, or a good portion of the better players, agreed to fix. It was the Chicago White Sox, but they've long been called the Black Sox because they fixed the event so that the bettors could win, and they were paid handsomely for losing on purpose, right? Okay, and that obviously is against the law. Again, apparently, if you want to do this legally, you just need to set up I'm not going to go there. Set up a charity and get a good high-level job in the government. Giving money back to someone who made a decision that benefited you or your company. So we kind of saw some of this. We did see some of this just recently here in Havre with some of the crime that was going on at Rocky Boy. Remember, they got big grants to build a water project. One contractor then would let the subcontracts go to certain individuals, and they found out that those individuals or companies were giving money back to that main contractor personally, okay, or buying favors or doing those types of things. And so that obviously was illegal, and they obviously got in trouble, and there's some folks in jail as a result of that. And trends, we see Sarbanes-Oxley came up in the early 2000s as a result of Enron, really. We're seeing more prosecution for tax evasion, plea bargainings, yeah. This one's becoming very contentious down here. We're seeing seizures of assets and becoming very, very problematic for the businesses. And ultimately, businesses that are proven innocent have a devil of a time sometimes getting their assets back. And oftentimes, even the seizure of the assets then creates all kinds of operational problems for that business that are really hard to fix then as a result of that. So that one's becoming interesting. I think we talk about that in some later chapters. So there you have chapter 13. Thanks.